Hello, this is David Henry Young. I live in the Philippines with my wife in Camarines Sur, Laganoy, city of Laganoy. Been here for 6+ years, and God's just changed my life entirely. So I wrote a story back in 2007, around the same time in May, about an incident in the Vietnam War, and I'm just wanting to read it to you. It's called The Stolen Helicopter. The night is warm and windy, and Billy had just run in from the rear gate and at the top of his breath said our ambush patrol had just been ambushed. He was sweating profusely and was jittery with the bad news. 2 Marines had been shot, and I knew we needed a medevac quick. I had never called one in and had no idea how to do it with a radio. So we called it in by landline. Our camp was only about 1 mile across the rice paddies from 1st Medical Battalion. Our colonel had misappropriated $22,500 to build himself a helipad that we, as a motor transport battalion, did not rate. It was 0200 and the mosquitoes were few because of the wind, and the perimeter of the helipad was filling up with officers and senior NCOs who wouldn't be scratching themselves to death as they waited for the arrival of the helicopter. This was a big deal. The helipad was virtually unused except for the infrequent stop of a pilot in search of a cold beer. We offered only cold soda. The pad was located at the highest point of the camp, right outside the back doors of my 2 communication hooches. I was the comm chief for the battalion and was located on a small knoll. The colonel made it one of my duties to maintain the green sandbags in perfect dustless order around the helipad's perimeter and to install alternating red and blue lights at opposite corners. It was a pretty helipad, made of a new green composite material, not like the normal pads made of steel-holed planking. Yep, the colonel did a fine job, and the S3 captain was quietly trying to bring charges against him for the misappropriation funded. The whole scene was surreal, especially when the CH-46 Knight medevac showed up. It fit neatly on the colonel's pad, keeping its rotors wheeling, just sitting there looking like a large thalidomide grasshopper, and as loud as a roaring lion in the ear. Thank God I had my men keep the colonel's green sandbags dustless, else we all would have been blinded by the rotor wash. I looked around the helipad into the faces of all the assembled actors in this strange play, and they were all amazed at the sight of the helicopter. It was then that I began to feel a weight on my heart and an insistent feeling that someone had to do something. The feeling grew strong in me as I turned and saw my favorite corporal, Benny Stahl. He was the fattest Marine I had ever encountered. He had a thyroid problem and couldn't lose weight to save his life. Every morning he'd climb up and run down the large hill between our camp, OP1, and gain weight. He was stripped down to the waist because he also suffered badly from prickly heat and was sweat-dripped looking at me through his thick black horn-rimmed glasses, and was also known for his fine poems, the pride of Minneapolis. He was standing on the other side of Staff Sergeant Livermore, a man I detested. I was a buck sergeant, and he had one more stripe than me. He had been recently inserted over me in the comm section due to me flunking an Inspector General's inspection of my section. Staff Sergeant Livermore had previously been the supply sergeant. He wasn't even a communicator and knew nothing about radios. Thankfully, the general had a first lieutenant who had attended the same communication schools as I had, he was a Mustang, an officer who came up through the ranks, head up the section, and I was now under a correct chain of command. For a year, I had been running the section by myself, and the job was getting done. I had no officer over me except a company commander, a captain, and he left me alone. I also didn't report to the first sergeant about my day-to-day matters. His only problem with me was that the other company sergeants complained to him that I didn't live with them. I lived with my men. And when he confronted me, I told him he could bust me to corporal, but that I wasn't going to leave my men. He just stomped off, yelling at me to stop getting him into trouble. The other sergeants were mad at me also because I didn't lead ambush patrols. I was too busy doing work for the colonel to do much of anything else. The reason I flunked the IG inspection was that I was carrying 14 Prick 25 radios off the books. I had to get them using an alternative supply system. Marines helping Marines, though the general wasn't impressed with my logic. We needed the radios mainly for our gun trucks, and the colonel had told me to get them any way I could. So I made some calls and discovered another supply system and got caught using it. I looked past Staff Sergeant Livermore into Benny Stahl's sweaty eyes and shouted, "Someone has to do something." Benny stared at me, his chest and rolling fat dripped in perspiration, and suddenly ran onto the helipad and into the helicopter. He sat down, and I could see him through he sat down sitting like a stone through the porthole in the fuselage. The heavy feeling I was having just doubled. I turned to Staff Sergeant Livermore, gave him my radio, and yelled very unkindly, "Here, do something useful," and ran to the helicopter. The crew chief's face appeared baffled. He looked me in the eyes and shouted, "What the F-U-C-K are we doing?" The helicopter had been sitting on the helipad for almost 10 minutes. I motioned and shouted, everything was so damn loud, for him to tell his pilot to take this bird up and over the ridgeline behind the camp and not show him where to land. With great relief visible on his dirty, sweat-streaked face, he smiled and yelled, "Okay." I had a flash of the television show Wagon Train when Ward Bond was finally told by Clint Eastwood's character, Rowdy Yates, that he had found the path to take through a difficult canyon trail. So up we went. The feeling was effervescent. I rode trucks, not helicopters, angling over the hills and down to a clearing by a black-topped road where we landed. I told the crew chief that we'd be back shortly. Benny and I ran out into the clearing, noticing the ground was ruddy and uneven. We ran to where a M116 Husky, a lightly armored track vehicle, had backed up onto the hillside about 70 meters, waiting for the patrol and their wounded to work their way down the hillside. The night was especially dark as there was no moon, so it was slow going. The driver of the Husky was Sergeant Robinson, someone who I had always wanted to get to know. He was manning an M60 machine gun and listening to the tactical net on the Prick 25 radio. Meanwhile, Benny had gone down into the clearing, holding at the ready 2 M16 rifles. I thought he was crazy, standing there with an M16 on each hip, with no helmet or flak jacket. He was taking the John Wayne movies we watched a bit too seriously. I told Sergeant Robinson he could take care of the machine gun and I'd take care of the radio. I called up to OP1, that's observation post number 1. There were 5 observation posts on the ridgeline that surrounded, faced our camp, and down the road also was where there was home for the 26th Marine Regiment. I told Sergeant Robinson he could take care of the machine gun and I'd take care of the radio. I called up to OP1, where I had one of my radio operators watching over the radio relay shot we had set up so the camp could communicate with our convoys when they were on the far side of the ridgeline. The operator's name was Pappy because he had joined the Marine Corps when he was 33 years old. I'm like 20, 21. He had been a history teacher back in the world. I asked him if they had any flares that they could shoot so as to provide light for the slow-moving patrol coming down the back hillside. I would direct their fire. It worked out pretty nicely, and soon the first wounded Marine was at the Husky. We put him on a stretcher, and 4 of us ran him to the waiting medevac chopper. I was praying the whole way not to drop him. I told the crew chief to come right back, and we'd have the other wounded Marine ready to go. And that's how it all worked out. I later heard that one of the men lost a leg. I never knew their names. I drove on the Husky back to the camp, and when we got back, everyone had left the little knoll where the helipad was, and suddenly I realized what I had done and began to shake. The colonel was going to kill me. Nobody had told me what to do. What I had done, I was in for it. But not one person in authority over me ever said anything at any time. It was as if it never happened, though I waited a month for something bad to happen to me. Then one day I got a call from a buddy communicator with the 26th Marine Regiment. Their base camp was next to ours, and he had said they had steaks and beers and for me to come on over. Lieutenant Myers, my comm officer, said, "Sure, go have one for me." So I drove over and looked in on my friend, Jeff Bemis. We called him Hondo because he was 6 foot 5 inches tall, packing 260 pounds, and just looked like Hondo. He had the duty watch and couldn't partake of the festivities. The steaks were thick and the beer cold with corn on the cob. It was great. I ended up in a circle of NCOs and one captain with a green beret. Not like the Army Special Forces, but green nonetheless. I had never seen a Marine wearing a beret before. He seemed like a nice guy. Anyway, as we were talking, someone used my name, and this captain perks up and says to me, "You're Sergeant Young? The Sergeant Young from 11th Motors?" I said yes, and he breaks out into this huge toothy smile and says, "You're the guy who stole the helicopter." Gulp. I gulped nervously and stuttered, "Yes, sir." Then he started laughing like a roar, and I just melted away to the command post where Honda was. I told him what had just happened, and he told me that the captain was CID, Criminal Investigation Division. And it was he who bought the beers and steaks. Hondo said that he was to call me over. I just about shit my pants and started shaking again, and just drove back and waited. But as before, not one thing was ever spoken to me about the helicopter incident. It took me months to calm down. I figured the CID captain investigated the incident and wanted to meet me, and found me harmless, and no charges were brought against me. Only God really knows the truth. I believe it was he that had me do what I did. It's the only thing that makes sense. David M. DeYoung, May 22nd, 2002, and March 18th, 2023. God bless you. Have a great time, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.